Brought to you by Barfoot and Thompson.
On the show today, I'm joined by the fabulous Kelvin Davis to talk about his inspiring story that led up to his book, 9 Lives of a Soldier and Sailor. Welcome to Property Matters. Welcome along to another Monday afternoon. Thanks for tuning in if you're listening live here on Planet FM, or if you've downloaded our podcast from your favourite podcast site, wherever you're tuning in. Thank you so much. Great to have you here. And a little bit of a different guest this week. As you know, every now and then we like to mix it up and take a little pause away from the property side and the investment side and focus on somebody that can inspire us, whether that's in leadership, management, or just in general life. And have I got a goodie for you today? A big welcome to Kelvin Davis. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Stephen.
It's great to have you here. I'll just get you nice and close to your mic there. Now, you're going to chat to us today about a very interesting story that sort of starts off in a Vietnam War that ends with running some incredible businesses. But before we do anything, let's just take us right back. Tell us a little bit about you. Who is Kelvin?
Okay, I was born in Tauranga, in a small farming community, Omakaroa, in January 1946. I shifted to Hamilton, went to Hamilton Boys High School, and in the fifth form at Hamilton Boys High School, I realised that I wasn't a great scholar. In fact, I was a bad scholar, and lost interest in school and any emotional contact I had with the teaching staff. And I wanted to join the Navy, and I was accepted to the Navy and about May of the year, and once I knew I was in the Navy, then all further study ceased. So then I joined the Navy, and as you said, I had an interesting time in the Navy. It started my career. I learned so much from the Navy that set me up in my later business careers and things I'd learned from the military. But as a young medic in the Navy, as well as travelling around the world on different New Zealand Navy ships, I got to serve in Vietnam, and that was quite an experience for a 22, 23-year-old.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So tell us about that. What was involved in being a Navy medic?
Well, okay, after our basic core training, we went into core training, which was learning all about the medical side of it, everything from first aid, anatomy and physiology, laboratory, X-ray, diagnostics, nursing, and we had the basics of that. But as we were promoted, we had to learn more, sit more examination. It was a bit like the old-fashioned apprenticeship. Rather than being all theory, a lot of it was practice, and you had to teach yourself. An opportunity came to serve with the New Zealand Services medical team in 1968 in Vietnam, and that was a collection of Navy, Army, Air Force medics, all senior medics, equivalent of a sergeant or above, and normally 2 or 3 doctors. And we operated in a small rural area where there's no other hospitals, and in a place called Bong Son, a population of about 1 million, and we treated civilians, casualties of war, and also diseases, tropical diseases.
Because when you hear sort of medics in the war, the TV show MASH instantly comes to you, to your forefront. Was it anything like that?
Not really. MASH would have been paradise for us.
Right, I can imagine.
As a good example, as I've written in my book, the first day I arrived, I walked into what was an operating theatre, and here was 2 Navy medics and one of the doctors doing surgery with their hands deep inside the abdominal cavity of a patient, a civilian, no gloves, no masks, no gowns, stripped to the waist, pistol hanging on the hip, and deep into it. And when I look back at some of those situations, there's many amputations we had to do from booby traps and mines and all the rest of it. But if we weren't there, then all of those patients would have died. There's no alternative for them.
So what was it like being so young in a conflict zone like that?
In my book, once again, I write about the emotions. It was quite emotional. I used to think about it at night. It certainly affected me and probably affected a lot of others. So a lot of the time I was working out in the boondocks, out in the rural areas by myself, and was living and accommodated in an American Army camp. And as the only New Zealander there, working the district and triaging patients, it was quite emotional and lonely at times. Lonely.
I can imagine. Can you share with us one of your sort of toughest or, I guess, most challenging moments from those days as a medic?
There's a lot of humour in the book about different situations where one old elderly patient, a Vietnamese guy who was very sick and nobody was looking after him, and I was looking after him. And then one day in the theatre, one of the Vietnamese nurses came in, and she said, they're all laughing, 2 or 3 of the girls came in, they're laughing, and they said, Buxy Chalky. Well, Buxy was doctor in Vietnamese, and we were all called doctors even though we were medics, and Chalky was my nickname. They said that the patient had offered his daughter to me in his marriage. And from then on, the staff, the Kiwis and the nurses came through most days saying that, well, there's a Buddhist monk out there who wants to talk to you. There's a couple of water buffaloes and white ribbons out there. And they gave me hell, but unfortunately a week later he died, so the wedding was off. Oh. But I never got to meet the so-called bride. But that was a funny situation, but perhaps my worst situation was I got caught in an ambush, and I was with 3 Americans returning home late at night on anniversary day, and we were all hit in the first 3 seconds. We saw these people emerge out of the shadows just on dusk when we were driving, and we should have been back in camp, and we're hit with a hail of gunfire, and we're all wounded. The Jeep took about 28 bullets. I got shot in the chest. And so we're only saved in those split seconds by 2 American tanks that saw my Jeep swerving. And I had difficulty trying to control it, having been shot, and basically felt like being hit with a baseball bat. And it just laid me flat in the seat, and my head hanging out the side because the Jeep had no doors. And we're just sort of careering all across the road. So that was probably the worst situation, Your life flashed before your eyes when that happened.
What did your family say when you come back and tell stories like that?
Well, one of the reasons I wrote the book was because there's many things in the book. It's called 9 Lives of a Soldier and Sailor. And if I was a cat, I would have used up 4 of those lives. Okay. And they're described in detail in the book, and my family didn't know. Yeah. They knew I'd been wounded because they got a telegram. But my girlfriend at the time, who was also ex-Navy, she was in England on an OE. And so I hadn't told her, but she found out through my parents. So there's a lot of life and death situations in the book that I experienced, not only in Vietnam but through my commercial diving career, where the family didn't know until I'd written the book.
Yeah.
And then there was a lot of questions.
I bet. And what a beautiful memoir for them to keep, and for grandchildren and great-grandchildren to keep. Yeah. When you look at modern medical practices today versus the tools and equipment you had to deal with, do you look back with pride on how much you managed to achieve and the lives that you saved, or does it kind of anger or annoy you how ill-equipped we were back then?
No, I think as a young person, I don't regret my time in Vietnam, though there was a lot of anti-war protest at the time for what we were doing. But just to give the listeners an idea, the first day I walked into the so-called operating theatre, which is the size of a kitchen, and for the operating table we had a kitchen table, and we had a total of 28 instruments, which included a carpenter's saw for amputations. That's all we had. And the most operations we ever did in one day while I was there, we did 22 operations.
Wow.
That's from amputations, abdominal surgery, all sorts of injuries.
And what did anaesthetic look like back then?
Anaesthetic was very basic.
I shudder to think.
We had the old-fashioned, what they called a Schimmelbusch mask, which went out of date in 1956, and we were using it in 1968, which is basically a metal frame that fitted over your mouth and nose with a gauze cloth, and you dripped chloroform or ether onto the mask, and that's what we use.
Wow.
And if anybody's got memories of having that type of anaesthetic in their early childhood, then you can remember the struggles as you gagged and choked. And so that's what we used, you know.
Wow.
That was our basic anaesthetic. Yeah.
So when it comes to writing these stories in your book, you know, what were kind of the rules, I guess, for yourself? What went in the book and what didn't? Because I imagine there's a lot of emotions tied up with that early time in your life.
Everything's in the book.
Nice.
I had a well-known author, Ruth Shaw. Many listeners will know her from her very popular books in the wee bookshops, and she's down Manor Road. She's a friend of mine, and every question when she pushed me to finish the book was, is it in the book? And so everything's in there. There's no holds barred. All my emotions, what I felt at the different times. And my biggest emotional thing, which comes out in the book, was that when I was staying with the Americans, I was only with them for 6 months till I was wounded and pulled out. But in that time, out of 200 American soldiers, 40 were killed. Mm-hmm. And being the only Kiwi in the camp, they all knew me. I didn't know all of them, but those 40 people I knew. And so that was always sad, because we'd have a memorial service 2 or 3 days later where they put the rifle and bayonet in the sand and the helmet on top with their boots, and the padre or the commanding officer would read a few words, and that was it. But one of the biggest things, and I write about that in the book, is knowing that my friends had been killed and I knew their parents hadn't been told.
Yeah.
And you look at the movies about Vietnam and the military arriving at their door in some little rural town or a city, knocking on the door with a flag and a telegram. And I'd sit there at night by myself thinking that his poor parents, you know, tomorrow or the next day, they're going to know something that I know. And I felt a lot of guilt about that. As a 22-year-old, it probably caused post-traumatic stress in later life. You know, so those are some of the things, you know.
Yeah, thank you for your honesty. Are there people from that time that you still stay in touch with today?
Yes, there's not many of us left now. No. Because we're all, most of the team members that were there have died.
Right.
You know, but the ones that are left are probably all 77, 80 years plus, you know. Yeah. So, yeah, there's more than probably 3/4 that have passed on.
So, when you left the battlefield, your attention turned more into being a diver. Was this all through the Navy, or did it carry on beyond the Navy? Where did this sort of spark of wanting to be a diver come from?
I was always interested in scuba diving, and in my early days in the Navy, I'd been taught by a Navy diver, just, you know, for weekend diving. We'd go chasing crayfish or scallops or something like that, so I learned from him. Then the opportunity came, even though I was a medic, and I was a chief medic at that stage, at about 28 years of age, which is quite old to be doing diving training. So I went on the diver training, and I was by far the oldest. Most of them were at 20, 21. So I had a hell of a job keeping up with them physically. You know, I did a lot of training beforehand. At nights I used to run for an hour or so to try and get fit. So I discussed different types of Navy training, what we did for diving, and then I added a bit of adventure to my life in the Navy, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But coming back from Vietnam, back to Devonport and working in the Navy hospital, which was Band-Aids and Disprin, you know, it was pretty dull.
Right.
And I pondered long and hard whether I was going to stay in the Navy, and it was a hard decision. And that was one of the emotional things in the book, is the risk I was going to take to leave the Navy, you know. So then I went on to commercial diving, and I discussed that in depth, different types of diving.
Is there a favourite story from when you were doing commercial diving?
The funny side of it, one was that I was off the Taranaki coast working on the Maui field, and I would start diving normally about midnight, and I would be in the water for 4 or 5 hours on the bottom, and then I'd come out, decompress, and the next diver that followed me was a Malaysian guy. And the job we were doing down there was a pipeline that carried the gas from New Plymouth, from the beach, all the way out to Maui Tower, which is in 360 feet of water. So we walked the pipeline. We didn't swim it, we walked it with a ship positioned above. Pitch black at night, our shift was. Often, because we're doing underwater concreting to reinforce the pipe, there was no visibility. And so the diver would be walking on the bottom, and with that type of work, you'd have a big helmet on, which gave you radio communications. It gave you your air or gas, and it gave you hot water to keep you warm, and it went circulated through your suit, and a safety line. And so we could talk to the diver, or not us personally on the boat, but the controlling and the supervisor could talk to him. And on this particular occasion, at about 5 o'clock in the morning, it's still dark, the Malaysian guy said he wanted more umbilical, which is the line that secured you, had your radio. He wanted more. And we could see it was floating on the surface, so the supervisor said to him, go back and check, you must be snagged. And then he came back and he said, I can't move. And then he let out a yell. And because he'd only been in the water a matter of minutes, we could get him back. And he came, we pulled him to the surface, he climbed right there, he ripped his mask off, and he was a babbling mess, speaking in Malaysian. He finally calmed down, and what had happened, when he couldn't move, he felt all around him, and it was a large octopus that had him pinned into the pipeline. Oh, no. It was living under the pipeline, and he was the second guy to be caught. Whether it was the same thing. But the interesting thing is the next day, he was on the plane, he was finished diving, he was gone.
Out of it.
Returned.
Done by an octopus.
Yeah, done by an octopus.
Literally.
Yeah, so that's a funny, unusual one, but there's many, many instances about diving and getting caught in pipelines and running out of air, buried alive underwater, and with just my feet sticking out of the sand, and other instances of other divers. Another funny one was in Bass Strait, in a diving bell, middle of winter, very cold, about 250 feet, and we're in a diving bell, which the bottom of the bell is open, so there'd be one diver in the bottom working, and one inside for security and to assist him. And all of a sudden you hear a hiss, and you think there's a gas leak, and you can't find one. You look down, and here was a seal with his head right up inside with his whiskers twitching. Stayed here for about 30 seconds looking. Brilliant. And then disappeared. He didn't obviously light the gas, which is a mixture of helium and oxygen.
Brilliant. Brilliant. When you look back at your time as a diver or in the Navy, obviously there's a fondness. Is there anything that you took from that time that you then carried through into your entrepreneurial life later on when you sort of got into the businesses? What did you draw from those Navy and diving challenges? I think
there's a lot. One of the things I took from going to high school, which I didn't enjoy, and I just wanted to play around and eat my lunch probably, was going into the Navy. The education was like the old apprentice. It was a lot easier to learn. Yeah. There was emotional connect. You could learn. And it created a challenge in me. Even though when I was in the Navy, I was at the top of my career, earning good money, but I needed a challenge. And to give away all that comradeship and the enjoyment of the Navy and the travel and the good money, I took the risk of going out in the business. And when I first went out, I was going to buy a business, and then the guy decided he didn't want to sell it. So I was out of the Navy. So that's when I went commercial diving. Right. And but a lot from the Navy I took, just the curiosity was one thing.
What made you finish the diving?
I had an accident, a rig sunk, and I was trying to salvage the rig, and at 4 o'clock in the morning, cold morning, a wire from the towing tug on the barge came across the front of the barge and smashed me in my thighs, both thighs. So it was a quick trip to shore and up to the hospital.
Yeah. And that was it.
Yeah.
Oh. So after the Navy and the diving, what adventures did you get into next? Was it straight down sort of the business entrepreneurial path, or did you experiment with other careers first?
No, it was straight into business. I always wanted a challenge of business.
Okay.
What I wanted was a more challenge in my life. I didn't want to go in wages and work for somebody else. In my diving industry, I'd done that, and one of the companies I worked for, a New Zealand company at that time, up in Whangarei, I witnessed some terrible things between the different foremen. It was a construction company, and how they were picking on a lot of the staff, and vice versa,
right,
with union strikes, but the foremen weren't good. And I looked at those guys and what I'd learned in the Navy, because for the rank I had to go through a lot of leadership training.
Right.
And I took that, I thought, this is terrible. I want out of here. I don't want to work for and put up with that. I wasn't happy, so that's when I wanted to start creating businesses, which I did.
So tell us about that. Take your time. Talk us through. What business did you create?
Okay, the first one I created, and which grew into quite a large company with branches in South Auckland, basically on the North Shore in the Wairau Valley, then to North Auckland, Otahu, and then down into Hamilton. It was doing plastic repairs, and at that time there was nobody doing plastic repairs, plastic grills on cars, were the only plastics available. So I started making some investigation. I found out somebody that could teach me. It was a Hungarian guy who worked in the industry for 30 years in Germany, who were the leaders. So I got the equipment in from Sweden. I started under my house, and I said to my wife, and this was straight after diving, where the salary was pretty good. If you're into saturation diving, at that time you could earn $1,000 a day tax-free.
Wow.
Overseas international waters. So that was big money. That's like $5,000 a day now. So I said to my wife, we're going to budget $50 a week. And but what happened was I got a tiger by the tail. And the work I was doing, I started under my house in my basement. And sometimes I worked till 3 in the morning, went to bed, got up at 9 and started again. And that was 7 days a week for 1 year. The only day I had off in the first year was Christmas Day. And so that created, as I said, a tiger by the tail, created good income, and the business just grew from there. And then I took commercial premises. And one of the biggest things I learned from the Navy, and I write about it in the book, and I took in a business, the Navy always said, you're born with 2 ears. You should listen twice as much as what you talk. And it's better to sit there and look dumb than open your mouth and prove it. And so I used to follow that, and just listening to other people I considered that might know a lot more than me, I learnt a lot. And a lot of opportunities developed by just listening.
Absolutely. And where did this go next?
Okay, well, we started off with the plastics, and then I needed to do spray painting for painting those. So that part of the business grew into spray painting of all plastics, and then into everything from boat bits and pieces, motorcycle bits and pieces. But then during the winter we wanted a heating process to heat it, because we're into two-pack paint. So we wanted to paint. So with a paint company, we developed the paint, which then I took to companies in Australia and America, and I sold it there. And it was a specially formulated paint, which we private labelled. And from the paint, we needed something to dry it. So that's when we learnt about infrared, which I knew nothing about. So I had to get my son's sixth form physics books out and find out about infrared. And so I went to America and to trade shows, and I came back with infrared and started that in New Zealand. So I was creating and designing infrared for all types of industries, not only paint, but automotive, assembly plants like the Nissan factory, Air Force, all types of industries for heating and curing.
That's incredible. Because I'd love to do a survey of how many successful New Zealand businesses started in someone's basement.
Yeah.
And I bet you there's a lot. That is that Kiwi way, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. You also ended up, being an investor, but into commercial property.
Yeah, one of the things I realised, and I had a very canny old lawyer who since he passed on, and he was into property, and he used to just come and talk to us, and after that, never charge us, and so he was like a mentor, and he was telling us about commercial property, and then I met 2 or 3 good guys. They were property real estate salespeople, one in Barfoot and Thompson, and so they used to find things, buildings that we were looking for. So we had a thing, and there's 4 of us in the business, my wife and a Navy person, Ray, who's still my partner after nearly 50 years, and his wife. And so the 4 of us set about with our business. It had good cash flow. So we'd look at the buildings, and we'd buy them, and we'd use the surplus income from our existing businesses, plus the rental from that new buildings, and often we would repay it within 2 to 3 years, and then we'd go about buying another block of factories, and we just created until we had 18 factories, and we're just paying them off. And one of the reasons for that was the same lawyer who had 42 factories he owned either in trust for his clients or himself. He always told me, he said, if there's a downturn in the commercial world and you have to give rent relief, you can. If you've got a mortgage at 15% or whatever it may be, and you're in debt, you'll win, because you can give free rent if you have to, as long as they're paying the service fees and the insurance and everything else. So we always remember that, and so we were never too far in debt.
When you look back during that time, you just mentioned the lawyer as one. Who were other people that kind of inspired you or helped sort of lead you through this journey?
I had an old panel beater that worked for me who, during the Second World War, his father was a mayor in one of the local suburbs in Auckland, and he told him, he said, Owen, how much money have you earned this month? He said, I've earned £100, Dad. He said, how much you got in the bank? He said, £50. He said, that's what you've earned. And he was teaching me in his own way about debtor control. That was one of the biggest things in all my different companies. I had 4 or 5 at one time, was debtor control. The other thing he told me was he talked about the local doctor who was criticised by the local people in the area, because if a patient hadn't paid within 1 or 2 weeks, he'd go knocking on their door at night to get payment. And people criticised him for that, saying they can't afford it. He said, they can't afford to not pay me, because if they owe me money, they'll never come to see me. And if they're sick...
True.
And that's what I found with debtors also. That if they owed you money, then they started thinking about it and they'll go somewhere else. So I always made it so the debtors could pay.
Good advice. Love the doctor analogy.
It was a good one.
So let's turn now to your book, 9 Lives of a Soldier and Sailor. What inspired you to suddenly sit down and write this? Well,
reaching my twilight years, 78 at the time, I thought there's a lot of things that I've done in my life that people don't know about. Unusual things, in the Navy, Vietnam, and the title, 9 Lives, as I said, there's 4 occasions in there where I could have and probably should have died. And so I wanted to put that down for the family. And I'd been to a funeral, a veteran's funeral, and I realised then in the eulogies that his family didn't know anything about that veteran, and I knew what he'd done.
Right.
And so I felt that, and you can go to any funeral, and how many times afterwards having a cup of tea, think, I didn't know that about Joe or Jill. I wish I had have known. And it comes in the end, it's too late.
Yeah.
So I thought, I've got to put it down.
One of the nicest projects I ever worked on was going into a retirement village with a group of teenagers and asking every retiree to tell us the story that they've never told their family, and then we created a piece of theatre for their family around all the stories that no one knew, but then the actual family member was in the story with us, so the audience could work out whose it was. There wasn't a dry eye. And stories of mischief, the amount of grandkids that didn't realise how naughty their grandparents had been behind the movies and things, but it's so important, because otherwise those stories are lost.
They are.
So, great supporter of you writing it. Talk about the process, though, because you've self-published this, so you've taken a big risk. You've had to do it all yourself. What was the journey like writing this, and would you write another?
It was interesting. It brought a lot of memories back at different times when I was writing about this. The reason it made it reasonably easy to do it, because while my girlfriend was in England on her OE, I used to write 3 or 4 times a week.
Right.
And so she'd kept all those letters, and she still got them after 55 years. So I had all her letters. I used to keep a diary, because I was by myself a lot of the time. I just write things down in my diary, and so I've still got the diaries, and with the diving, I've still got the logbooks. And so I had all of that to work from. So it's just a matter of process. I'd be laying in bed at night, and I'd be what I called mind mapping, and then I'd get up and write a few things down, and then I'd create chapters, and it would go from there. But I did hit the wall once, and I had to have a break because I couldn't get my mind back in the right situation. I realised that the easiest thing to do once I started was to stop and forget about it. So I thought the only way, the challenge was I had to tell 2 or 3 people that I was writing it.
Okay.
And so they consistently, how's the book?
Right.
How are you going? I knew I had to do it.
Yeah.
Otherwise I would have walked away from it. So I put a trap. I set a trap for myself.
And were there things left sort of on the cutting room floor where, not that you didn't want to tell it, but physically a book can only be so big?
There's probably a few things, but I'd say 95% of it's in there. The raw bones, it's emotion and everything, and what I felt at the time. And because the letters and my diaries were quite descriptive, and when reading those, it brought it all back to me.
Why did you self-publish?
It's very difficult for a person on a memoir autobiography to get out in the marketplace unless you're an All Black or a well-known figure or somebody like that, being a no-name person, and then started off for my family and then friends, and then the editor said, you've got to put this out there. They were reading the book and they said, it's got to go. Yeah. You've got to do it. So I just self-published it,
Brilliant. What would be your top tip for someone thinking of doing this journey, having written it now? From a self-publishing point of view?
Do it.
Just do it.
It's going to cost a bit of money. Yeah. But if you can afford to do it, and that was advice I got from a surgeon friend who did it. And, so I've got no regrets.
Yeah, and you've really got out there and publicised it. You've done a great job. I think I'm coming at the end of your journey of speaking to media. Yeah. But congratulations on that. A lot of our listeners on this show are self-employed contractors, business leaders or managers. What advice would you give someone trying to survive in this fast-paced world that we're in today, based on what you've experienced in your journey?
Well, there's probably 2 things that I learned in running the business. Was I learned about KPIs, and I really studied those, and then in my later years in the business, I used to teach it, at night classes for, community classes that were done by different groups. And the KPIs in the service industry are very valuable. You can record everything, and you can see what your earnings are per day, per hour, per worker, per vehicle, per anything you want, just on an Excel sheet. So that was one thing. KPIs are very good. We also got an award in 1999, won the North Shore Westpac Trust Enterprise Award. Yep. And that was for teaching staff. And often we had some island staff or Asian staff in our industry who are very quiet and shy. And you could ask them, well, what are you going to do? Can you do this? Can you do that? So we found a technique. We'd go up to them and just, shoulder to shoulder, be talking to them, and you'd plant a seed in their mind. What do you think this would work? And then when we had a group meeting later on, we'd pull that person out and say, this person said we should do this, we should do that. So creating their idea, and they grew it.
Yeah.
They wouldn't respond, otherwise they're shy. And English was their second language. But just involving them.
When you look back at sort of leadership, the leadership you've given, but also leadership you've witnessed in all your journey, is there sort of standout great leadership moments or great leadership tips that you've seen?
Not that I can think of, nothing that comes to mind, except, look after your staff. Sometimes, unfortunately, we often became a banker for our staff, but that was one of the things you did. Just work with your staff,
Now, you see, the book was obviously inspiration for your family to read the stories. Now that it's out in bookstores and libraries, who do you think it's aimed at, or who is going to pick this up and love it?
Well, it's quite.
And you've had some feedback already. Yeah,
it's quite surprising. I've had feedback from surgeons that have looked at the medical side of it, diving people, but probably most of the feedback I get are from the ladies, and they comment about where I was away so often, on the ships, their insight into what military life was like, and the wife left at home. Like when I was my first trip away, my son was 3 weeks old, and I was gone for 6 months. Now that really got to women, and they wanted to know more about that, and more about my wife and her role in it all. So it's been all different types of feedback to it,
Before we went on air, you mentioned that people were buying multiple copies, coming back to you.
Yeah.
Later going, can I get another one or another couple or a Christmas present? I mean, that in itself has to be the best Google review you can get when someone reaches out to buy more.
Well, I've had one woman come back and read it, and over a period of 2 months she's bought 5 copies for her family, her friends for Christmas and birthdays. So they can get that on an email. If they Google the name of the book, there's about 4 pages of shops that are selling it. Not all shops will have it now. Some will have sold out, and I'm probably not doing a reprint. But if they can contact me on email and perhaps they can be on the podcast, I'm quite happy. I've got books at home I can pass on.
And we should tell our listeners, you say I'm not doing a reprint. You've already done 3 reprints, and this only came out in September. Yeah. That's incredible. Someone might be listening that wants to fund the reprint number 4.
Maybe. Yeah.
We'll give the details at the end of where you can email us to get Kelvin's information. You mentioned earlier, right at the start, something that sort of sat with me, and you mentioned some of the humour in the war. How important was that to survive?
I think it was very important, because the day-to-day work that we were doing, it could take a real toll on you, I can remember at different times we had some young kids, probably 2 or 3, and they were patients, and they'd been burned. They were with us for many, many months getting treatment. And when we were going around the hospital ward, as it was, they'd often ride on our shoulders, things like that. And so it made it enjoyable,
and more human, perhaps,
and more human, But a lot of the fun you had to create yourself,
Is there a favourite chapter in the book, or is there a family member's favourite in the book that they've gone, I really love when you tell this story?
I think most of my family is probably my son. When he read the original PDF copy, he came back to me and he said, I didn't know about this, I want to take you out to dinner. We're going to Ponsonby. So he took me to the steakhouse, and he's asking me all sorts of questions over a wine and a nice steak. And he said, do you want to go back to Vietnam? I said, yeah. He said, good, we're booked. We're going in 3 weeks.
Oh, really?
And so he wanted to go back and see the areas where I'd been. Mind you, it all changed, but it was good. It was a good bond. Yeah. And he thoroughly enjoyed it, just sensing and walking the same steps and things like that. So
that would have been an emotional journey for you too. It's so lovely to tell those stories with someone.
It was, it's good,
Oh, what an awesome end to the tale.
Yeah.
So the book's available now. It is out in some bookstores, as we said, as some are already selling out. It's available in libraries, and you mentioned to me earlier it's also available through Amazon.
Yeah, on Amazon as well, yeah.
Brilliant. And if you can't track one down, email me at propertymatters@barfoot.co.nz and I'll send you Kelvin's details so that we can get that book out to you. What a beautiful, beautiful story. I hope other people are listening and inspired, whether it's a war story or their own journey, to actually tell their story through a book.
Yeah, well, there's a few people contact me and said I've been doing, group talks to people from Rotary to yachting clubs and church groups. So, if anybody wants it, I'm quite happy to go and have a chat to them.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Oh, Kelvin, thank you so much for coming on Property Matters tonight, for battling Auckland's traffic at this time of the day to come and chat to us. I think we could have talked for hours. I feel like we've just warmed up.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. And if you want to find out more, email me at propertymatters@barfoot.co.nz. That's us for another Monday. Have a fabulous week as we do the wind down towards Christmas. We can see the end coming, and we'll catch you again next Monday. Have a great week, everyone. Take care.